It is now the second week of March and we are quickly approaching spring. So in this video, I want to share with you guys all the things I do at this time of year, set up my garden for the best success when spring does arrive. And also, it's drizzling a little bit, so let's see how far we get. Before we get into those tips, I wanted to give you guys an update on this broccolini. I showed you guys how I trimmed back all the flowering parts of it, and some of it is coming back as pretty much instant flower stalks, but the rest is actually producing really nice broccolini florets. So overall, I think I'll get another couple weeks of production out of this plant, but I have to stay on top of it because these things are flowering real fast. Also, in case you're wondering what this is called a martenitsa. This is something that Bulgarians traditionally wear in the month of March. It's to symbolize good health, good weather, the coming spring, and everything that goes along with it. So the idea is that you wear it for the whole month of March, and then once you either see the first stork flying by or the first buds on a tree breaking and blooming, that is when you actually hang it up in a fruit tree to bring good fortune to your garden, to your life, everything in between. So here in San Diego, I already have trees that are blooming and budding just fine. So I'm gonna just wear it until I either rip it or until the end of March, and then I'll hang it on one of these new fruit trees that I planted. So let's get into the first tip though, because it's a very crucial one if you're growing fruit trees, or really anything that fruits at all. Whether it's a tree, a bush, or a shrub, anything that produces fruit will really benefit from some amount of fertilizer at this point in the year. So right here I have one of my avocados in container, and over here is the very prolific bear's lime, which still has fruit on it and is also setting new blooms at the same time. If you're in San Diego, definitely try growing a bear's lime because it does really well here. Now the tip here is to make sure you fertilize at the beginning of spring, and the reason why you want to do this is because this tree is about to put on a lot of new growth. It's been spending its time in the winter sort of being semi-dormant or maybe even fully dormant for some of the deciduous trees like apples, pears, peaches, things like that. So they are actually starved for nutrients. The early season fertilizing that we're going to be doing here is going to set it up for not only success, but for really good fruiting and also healthy growth. So all I'm doing here is I'm moving aside the mulch. And when it comes to choosing a fertilizer, all you really want to look for is an organic, slow release, balanced fertilizer. In this case, this one is 333. That is a balanced fertilizer because all those numbers are the same. The Espoma starter one is also a fantastic option. It's a 433. Again, a little higher on the nitrogen, but overall well balanced. Spring is the time for green growth, so nitrogen is the most important nutrient you want to make sure you're providing your fruit trees. What I'm going to do here is I just have a spoon in here, nothing exact. You can get exact if you want to follow the instructions, but once you get it into the soil, just mix it in a little bit and then move this mulch back over and repeat the same step on the other side. If you're growing any type of berry, you want to make sure that for those, you do get a more specific mix, and that's because they tend to actually like growing in more acidic soil. So in this case, I have two blueberries or different varieties. This one over here has already started to set quite a lot of fruit, and they're actually sizing up quite nicely. So I don't really want to mess with that guy yet. I don't want to disturb the system it's in by adding more fertilizer because it's already well on its way to production. Now this one over here has started to flower, but doesn't have that much leaf growth yet, and I am more comfortable actually fertilizing it. So the way I'm going to do this is the same as the other trees. I'm just going to simply move this mulch aside and do one half and then do the other half. Now the reason why it's actually extra crucial for things like blueberries is because they will not produce fruit or look healthy or happy if they do not have acidic soil. So maintaining that acidic soil is most easily done with either soil acidifier or using a berry type fertilizer like this berry tone here from the Espoma Organics. So all I'm going to do is once again, chop it into the surface a teeny bit, just like this, and then I'm going to cover it back up with that mulch. Now the other thing to mention is that with these organic fertilizers, they slowly release their nutrients every time they get wet and watered. So as you water this plant, that fertilizer is going to break down, drip down into the roots, feed the plant, and keep it healthy and happy. Now there's another crop that almost all of you guys most certainly have in your garden. Let's go take a look at that one now because this is the best time of year by far to also fertilize that. So here I am at one of 4 of my total garlic beds, and what you're looking at is a field of green. When most people grow garlic, they think of the bulb and they start thinking of the nutrients that a bulb would need. But at this point in the year, the only thing this garlic is trying to do is put out tons of nice, healthy green growth. So you want to make sure you're fertilizing with something that has a slightly higher nitrogen number. In this case, I just went ahead and bought a garlic specific fertilizer. This one is 522. So again, the first number is nitrogen and that's the biggest. And it's just important you want to do this now because in order for a big bulb to occur, it needs a lot of leaf growth in order to harvest the energy from the sun to form that giant bulb. So if you're only going to fertilize garlic a single time of the year, I'd say that this is probably the most important. It's going to be the same tactic here, except that the nice thing about garlic is that I'm planting it in rows. One of the main advantages of planting in rows is for things like this when you're trying to fertilize. So the nice thing about planting in rows is that if I fertilize this row right here, I'm fertilizing 2 different rows of garlic at the same time. And I could skip the middle row, go to this one out here, and now I'm fertilizing all 4 rows of garlic by just putting fertilizer in 2 trenches. So just move the mulch aside. Just like any other time you apply fertilizer, really, you don't want to put it on top of the mulch, even though it's very tempting because it's much easier to do. And then you're just going to take your fertilizer and give it a nice sprinkle all the way across that area. Again, similar thing, I like to sort of bury it as best as I can. I'm not trying to be perfect here because the rain and watering that I'm going to be doing will also help make sure this stays nice and buried. So the next thing I'm going to do is just move that mulch right back over it. And it's probably going to rain later tonight, so I don't need to bother actually watering this in right now. But if you wanted to give it a quick jolt, you could hit it with some water right away. Otherwise, just wait for your irrigation schedule rain. It's not really a big deal. So I am going to be doing all this garlic later. So now let's move on to the next tip, which has everything to do with seedlings. All right, I'm gonna turn this fan off, but it's here to remind you guys to make sure you have airflow wherever you are growing your seedlings, whether that's outside or indoors. You wanna have a fan on it at all times. Not just to keep your seedlings robust by giving them movement and making their stem harder, but also to keep fungal diseases down and things like that. So this has been working great for me. I've had this EcoFlow battery for a few months now, and that's entirely how I've been powering the airflow in this greenhouse, as well as the heat mat over here has given me really fantastic results on my peppers. There's a couple empty spots here, but those are mostly the peppers that I got from Bulgaria. So I don't think that's the fault of anyone, but just the seed being a little bit dated. So let's get into this next tip though, because if you're at this stage of your growth for your seedlings, you're probably starting to see that you have 2, maybe 4 true leaves, and that is a very critical stage to get the best growth out of your seedlings. So let's talk about seedlings. In particular, I'm gonna focus a lot on tomatoes because this is the critical time of year for tomato success. And the thing I wanna point out here is that you want at least 3 to 4 true leaves. So the true leaves are the ones that actually look like the final plant, AKA a tomato leaf. Whereas the ones down here are the seedling or cotyledon leaves. Those don't really count for what I'm talking about. Once you have 1, 2, 3, 4 leaves like that, it's a great time to start fertilizing your seedlings. Think about it this way. This seedling right here only has access to A, the air, or B, this amount of soil that we've given it to grow in. Once it's exhausted all those nutrients, where's it gonna get nutrients from? It's not gonna come from nowhere. So we wanna make sure that we're supplementing it by giving it a little bit of a liquid feed. Now, when it comes to actually choosing your fertilizer, again, I always go for an organic type. You could do like a fish emulsion or really, honestly, any type of organic liquid fertilizer that doesn't have like some ultra specific use case. In this case, I think this one, yeah, it's a fruit and berry fertilizer, totally fine. And its instructions call for 4 tablespoons per gallon. Now, since we are feeding seedlings though, I'm only going to be putting in 1/4 strength, AKA 1 tablespoon. There's a couple different reasons for this. First of all, this plant is not very mature. So if I hit it with too many nutrients early on, I could end up actually killing off the roots because they just don't know what to do with all those nutrients. The other thing is that if you are putting too much nutrient into a young seedling, it's going to grow very rapidly. It's going to stretch itself out. It's not going to be as strong and it'll start to attract aphids. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this up. To fertilize your seedlings, you're going to do it just like you are watering your plants. The one thing I want to mention though is don't fertilize your seedlings if the soil is bone dry. Give them a water first and then fertilize them the next day. I feel like if you do it when the soil is totally dry, it's a little bit too much for the plant to handle because it's doing 2 things in that case. It's drinking water for the first time because it's dried out, and it's also sucking up a ton of nutrients at that same time. So it's too much for a young plant to take in. Try to keep those 2 things separate. Just make sure you're doing it in between watering cycles, basically. So you add your fertilizer just enough as if you were watering your plants. It'll soak into the root ball and go into your plant. You want to do this for any seedling you grow if you are planning on leaving it in cells for a little bit longer than you want to, like say you don't have space in your garden. And then the next option, which is something I'm going to be doing right now to all these tomatoes actually, is to pot them up. So let me show you a tip here on how to pot up your tomato seedlings, because a lot of people don't realize that you actually don't need to get rid of your tomato seedlings. Like for example, here I have 2 tomato seedlings in the same package of soil. We're gonna go ahead and split that up and pot it up separately. Here are 2 different ways of potting up your tomatoes. If you're just growing like 1 of each type, you're going to wanna just go straight into a bigger container like this 5-inch pot here. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and put in a little base layer of soil at the start. So this does have some holes, so I like to just give it a light tamping at the bottom here, just to make sure that that soil is actually settled in at the base. So now the next thing I'm gonna do is grab my tomato plants. Now I have 3 different tomatoes in the same 6 cell. So what I wanna do is, especially since Sun Gold is my absolute favorite cherry tomato, I wanna grow all of these. Now there's a couple different ways of separating them. You could either just pull them apart like so. Most of the time, I think that causes more damage to the roots, but honestly, it really doesn't matter. So there's one right there, has enough roots to get by. I'm gonna just set that down. Another over here. And that also has enough roots to get by. The one that's the biggest, I'm gonna go ahead and throw into the solo pot. And what I did is I just laid it down so that the root ball is actually at the base of the pot. All we wanna do here is just bury it up to these seedling leaves. I'm gonna go ahead and remove them. I'll leave one so you guys can see where it's at actually. And just go ahead and backfill. That's all you're really doing here. Now the soil that I have here that I'm using is a mixture of compost and potting mix. That's because I want to start giving these tomatoes more nutrients. The compost is going to provide some nice soil life and also a little bit of fertility to it. And it's going to make sure these tomatoes grow nice, happy, and healthy. So there you go, the seedling leaf has disappeared. And this has a couple different advantages when I'm speaking about burying a tomato deeply. Think of the stem we just buried, it's about that much. This is now creating an anchor. This plant is not just relying on the root ball to keep it intact. It has a section of the stem entirely buried in the ground. So this is now a much more stable, robust tomato plant. The other advantage is that every part that we buried is now going to produce roots. So instead of having just a root ball at the bottom, I'll have like a root log from there, which the roots could spread out once I plant it in my actual garden space. So that is one way. Especially if you're just doing one, I'd rather just go into a single larger container. Now, if you have a bunch, for example, determinants, or if you're crazy like me and you just can't get rid of your tomato plants, this is what you're gonna wanna do. Go ahead and get your container. In this case, I'm using the 4-inch 4 cells. I'm just going to fill it loosely. I'm not doing any sort of compression whatsoever, just topping it off like so. Then you're gonna grab your seedling, just like this, and you're gonna lay it right on top of the soil and simply take your other hand and press the root ball while you're pushing down on the plant deep into the container that you're using. Now it's buried itself. You could just go ahead and backfill it. Now we didn't get quite as deep for a couple reasons. First of all, this isn't as deep, so it's harder to get these leaves buried, but any amount of burial that you do is a net benefit. So let's go ahead and do another one. Again, I'm gonna put it on the surface like that and just press it all the way down until it stops moving and backfill it in. And there you go. You actually could just end up having literally one little root hair and the plant will still do just fine. Tomatoes have a wonderful ability of rooting all along their stem, just like I mentioned, so they don't need all those roots to make it into the pot when you're doing that pot up. If you're going in the garden though, I would try to get as many roots as you can, because out there, it's a different, harsher reality. So that's the name of the game for tomatoes. This is a great time to get your tomatoes potted up and ready to go into the ground. And also, if you haven't started your companion plants, this is a fantastic time to do it. So let me show you some of my favorites, in particular for growing tomatoes. The next task we're going to discuss is extremely important to your garden success, but first let's talk companion plants for tomatoes. My first choice here is a French marigold. There's many different kinds, colors, shapes, and sizes, but French marigolds in particular are really wonderful at deterring root knot nematodes, which is something that I've been struggling with here on my tomatoes. Basically, they're little worms that get inside your tomato roots, get them all swollen, water can't get into your plant, and then it suffers and sometimes even dies. So every single tomato I plant this year is going to be surrounded by French marigold without a doubt. The next one is something strictly out of convenience, and that is basil. Here I have the Everleaf Emerald Towers basil. The nice thing about that variety is that it doesn't go to bolt as often, meaning it doesn't flower. So you get a longer harvest window. And here in San Diego, I've actually had one in a container for well over 2 years. So it's essentially perennial. If you have downy mildew on your basil, which is like this sort of indented, dark, gray, black spot on your leaves, then the plant wilts and dies, then look for something that's a DMR or Prospera, which means DMR is downy mildew resistant, Prospera is a specific trademarked variety of basil. These will not get affected by that sort of disease. So it's just nice to have that insurance if it is a disease that you actually struggle with. The last one is again a flower, one I've talked about quite a bit, and that is the alyssum. There's 3 different varieties for you guys here: Allure Pastel Blend, Rosie O'Day, and Tiny Tim. The great thing about these is that they're all different colors, but they smell absolutely wonderful. They don't get big, so they'll never outcompete your tomato plant. And they attract the beneficial wasp that can't hurt you, don't worry, but will actually put the hurting on your tomato hornworms that are devouring your tomato leaves. They do so by laying their eggs inside the tomato hornworm, which then come out, devour the tomato hornworm, and you're scot-free. No tomato hornworms on your plant, and they look beautiful, and they won't outcompete your tomatoes. So speaking of competition, let's take a look over here, because there is some serious competition going on that's going to be hampering some growth on these plants. I'm down here with my chicken friends to talk about weeding. Now, it's not the most exciting topic, but honestly, it's a great way to get out in the garden early, and if you do your weeding now, it'll pay off so much. Things like garlic, onions, don't have very large roots. They don't have very adventurous roots. So when you have something like a grass growing next to it, this could easily outcompete your garlic and end up reducing the size of it by even up to half. Now, the other great advantage of doing this now is that things are still growing a bit slow. So it's just not going to get that large. But if you wait for spring to truly spring, well, you're going to be battling a monster behemoth weed instead of just a young seedling weed like this. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that right now it has been raining. The ground is soft. It's much easier to actually pull these weeds than it would be if you were to wait until springtime when things start to dry out a bit, and then these roots are just not going to pop out very easily. I did bring my Cobra head just in case I need to pull any of these tougher weeds, but honestly, the ground is so nice and wet right now that everything's just popping right out, and it's a pleasure to weed. The other things you want to focus on when it comes to weeding are perennial weeds, things like Bermuda grass. Now's your best chance to get rid of it, or at least try to. And also any freshly planted bed where you have young seedlings, onions, garlics, things like that that don't have the ability to outcompete those weeds. From this one tiny 4x2 size garlic patch, I was able to pull all these weeds, and that's not even counting the nasturtiums I just threw to the side there. So it might not look like there's a lot of weeds, but once you start pulling, you'll find that there's actually quite a bit. And this right here is direct competition for your garlic. And I know everyone at home wants big bulbs, so make sure you weed your plants and just keep an eye on it because it's only gonna get worse as you approach summer. So now let me reveal to you this area right over here, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to ignoring weeds for a little bit too long. So this is what you don't want to happen in your garden or even really in your yard. Most of this is stinging nettle, which I am kind of okay with, even though it really hurts my hands and legs when I brush up against it. But at least it is a beneficial sort of plant to have around. Now the problem here is that over here, I see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of seed heads on these plants. They might not be in my garden now, but a simple breeze could easily carry weed seeds from this part of the yard right down there to where my garden is. So keeping your boundaries actually under control will make a big impact on the rest of your weeding in your proper garden. So let me show you really quick how easy it is to deal with a section over here, because we're actually getting ready to put in a native shade garden. But I'll talk more about that a little later. I've got my trusty oscillating or hula hoe here, which I just sharpened up a little bit, and I'll show you how quickly it is to deal with this. Basically, the idea is that while these weeds are this teeny, it's extremely easy to deal with them. If they get much bigger and they start becoming as thick as like my pinky, well, no matter how sharp I make this, I'm gonna have a hard time actually weeding this. So let's just go ahead and time how long it takes me to do this, and we'll see if it's actually worth the effort. All right, just that section alone probably took, I don't know, a minute. Let's go ahead and try to do a little bit more here and see just how long it really takes. All right, that was a great little cardio workout for that short period of time. And it might not look like it's dead, but it is. It's just loosely sitting on the surface. And when the sun hits it the next couple of days, this will all dry down and basically turn into mulch. So the long-term plan here is to convert this to a native garden, but that'll be for a future episode. So now let's move on to the next task. Now, the next thing that I like to do at this time of year is establish my pollinator patches. Right here is one example of them. It's turned into mostly a blanket flower at this point, just because it's such a vigorous plant. I'm not too upset about it though, but I do want a little bit more variety. So this little strip here is going to be planted with more flowers, but they are going to be native flowers. As I mentioned earlier, I do have a long-term plan for a native shade garden there. That's going to be more of a landscaping project. Here we're just going to be establishing some sort of annual native flowering bed. So all I'm going to do here is take something like this, which is a potato fork or digging fork, refuse fork. I think it has a lot of different names. It's basically 4 spikes on a stick. And all I'm going to be doing here is just roughing up the soil. I want to make it easy for these seeds to get into the ground and not just scatter them on the surface or, you know, just make a couple holes and put the seeds in. I want to throw in a decent amount of seeds here so I get a nice healthy mix of different types of flowers. I'm going to keep it really close to the edge because I don't want to crowd this sort of pathway too much. So again, all we're doing is just roughing it up a teeny little bit. The nice thing about native plants is that they don't need anything fancy. They don't need compost. They don't need fertilizer. They just need some soil to grow in. If it's native soil, all the better. So again, that should be good right there. And I'll show you exactly which ones I'm going to be putting in here now. The first thing I'm going to be adding is some of this California Color Wildflower Mix. This is from Botanical Interest. These are mostly native to my area. They are native to California broadly, but not maybe necessarily San Diego. And now I also have some of these seeds from Theodore Payne Foundation, which is over in Los Angeles. Here are the different ones I have. One's a Phacelia, one's a native sunflower, and this one is just a mix of butterfly loving plants. So I'm gonna be putting this somewhere else because it's a little bit too complex for this area, but I'll be sprinkling in a couple patches of the Phacelia and also the native sunflower. Now, the important thing to remember when it comes to using a mix is that it is a mix. So it has a wide range of seeds and sizes. So take a look at that right there. It's not gonna all scatter into the same place. You wanna make sure that you're mixing this up before you scatter the seed, so you don't just get all of the same plant in one area. So I've mixed them up in my hand here. I'm going to be sprinkling in a nice wide patch here. So there we go. That section will be this mix of flowers. And now I'm going to be pocketing in some of that Phacelia and sunflower across the whole area, but I also wanna make sure I have at least some dedicated over here. So now we've added some seed in. The only thing left to do is to sort of tamp these down. I actually have a little bucket here with some leftover soil. So all I'm going to do is lightly sprinkle it over the top here. And then I'm gonna go ahead and walk all over this. And the walking on top is going to make sure that that seed makes good contact with the soil. So whenever you are seeding on the surface like this and you're not sure if they're buried, going ahead and walking on it is a really great way to make sure you have good contact with the ground. The contact is really going to be what's key to making sure these seeds germinate. If you just left them on the surface and they didn't have good contact, they might just rot out in the air as they get wet. This just kind of guarantees that your odds are much, much higher. This is a great time of year to actually be doing some pruning. If your fruit tree, for example, hasn't grown yet, you could still do some pruning. Pruning your bordering hedges like those guys, which definitely need to get dropped in their height, or maybe even pruning your perennials like your rose, which I have right here. Now, one of the things that's happened to this rose in particular is that now most of the soil is actually gone. It's settled maybe about 6 or even 8 inches from the top of the pot to where the actual rose is. So what I want to do here is actually reset this rose a bit. First thing I'm going to do is go ahead and prune some of the dead and diseased growth. So here I see some cracking. I'm going to go ahead and just drop this plant right down there. And over here I have a new bud developing on healthy growth, so I'm going to leave that. Now, anywhere where I see crossing branches or just dead growth, I want to go ahead and remove that because it's just not healthy for this rose to keep carrying. Again, more dead wood. That's the main thing I'm looking for now. If the rose had actually been actively growing at this point of the year, instead of just on the verge of growing, I would be pruning it down until I get to a leaf that has 5 different leaves on it. That is a sign that you could actually get new growth from that leaflet. If it only has 3, then you don't want to prune to that. You want to keep looking for that pair of 5 leaves. I'm going to go ahead and just remove this top branch here just to control the height. So that's the only thing I'm really trying to do here. I don't have any particular plan. I haven't prepared for this. I'm just simply cleaning up the things that I know benefit from getting cleaned up. All right, I feel pretty happy with this so far. Again, I'm not an expert when it comes to pruning roses. If you guys are, feel free to point out anything that I might have missed here. But the next thing I want to do is actually reset this pot by adding more soil. So there's the old root ball fully removed. Now I could go ahead and add some fresh soil to this and bring it up to the height it really should be at. So there we go. That's what it looks like at this moment. Let's go ahead and pop this in. And I might try to rewrite this plant. So what I mean is that right here, I don't like how it's tilting out, so I'm shaving it down a bit. I'm going to try to orient it so it's basically in the pot like this. So if you guys are wondering, this variety is called Iconic Lemonade. We got this one because it's a very fragrant rose. It's also been grown organically and we continue to grow it organically. Now that I have enough soil in here, we're going to fertilize, which is a major theme of this time of year, as you guys can see. And there we go, guys. We have a refreshed rose in the same container with plenty of new soil, plenty of nice fertilizer. The only thing left for me to do is add some mulch on top. But I want you guys to remind me to show you updates on this because I think this went quite well. I'm very pleased with how this turned out. And that's it for the spring tasks for now. These are the main things that I'm trying to do this time of year. Fertilize, clean up, pot up, prune, all the kind of maintenance stuff that's going to pay dividends once you get into the true spring and summer season. So let me know if you guys have any other tips you'd like to do around this time of year down in the comments. I'll be sure to reply. Thanks for watching.